Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs correspond to actual events. The Quiet Trail, a documentary account of the disappearance of Daniel Marsh, the 14 days that followed, and the truth that was found in the ground. The morning of Saturday, September 14, 2019, arrived in the eastern foothills of the North Cascades, the way most September mornings do in that country. Cold at the edges, with the smell of pine resin and damp granite hanging in the air like a curtain that hadn't been opened yet. By 6:15 a.m., the sky above State Route 20 was the particular pewter gray that precedes a clear day. The mountains behind it still black silhouettes, solid and featureless, as though cut from paper with scissors. The temperature at the Mazama Trailhead parking lot registered 41 degrees Fahrenheit on the thermometer, mounted to the ranger station wall. A small yellow thermometer with a red mercury line that a volunteer named Gary Tesler had installed himself in 2014 and checked religiously every morning. Gary Tesler was 68 years old, retired from a career driving trucks for a lumber supply company out of Wenatchee, and he spent 3 seasons a year as a volunteer interpretive ranger at the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest's eastern access points. He had thick white eyebrows that made him look perpetually surprised, and he wore the same olive fleece vest every day regardless of temperature because, as he told anyone who asked, it had been a gift from his daughter when she graduated nursing school, and he saw no reason to be precious about it. Gary Tesler arrived at the trailhead parking lot at 6:08 that Saturday morning and noted the presence of 2 vehicles, a silver 2017 Toyota Tacoma with a King County license plate and an older blue Honda CR-V with a cracked rear bumper that had been there since Thursday. He wrote both plate numbers in his log, as he always did, and unlocked the chain on the information kiosk. It was while he was posting the week's weather advisory, overnight lows dropping to 28 degrees Fahrenheit above 5,500 feet, early season snow possible above 7,000 feet, carry emergency bivouac gear, that the silver Tacoma's door swung open and Daniel Marsh stepped out. Daniel Marsh was 34 years old on the morning of September 14, 2019. He was 5 feet 11 inches tall, weighed 178 pounds, and had the particular kind of lean, functional build that comes not from a gym, but from years of carrying weight across uneven ground. His hair was dark brown, cut short on the sides and longer on top in a way that had no particular intention to it, and his face was clean-shaven except for a few days of growth that his wife Claire had told him. That morning on the phone made him look like a graduate student rather than a software project manager. He laughed at that. She told him she loved him. He said he'd call her from the summit of Goat Peak on Sunday afternoon, and if he didn't call by 4 o'clock, she should try again before worrying. He said, before worrying, twice. Claire Marsh would recall this detail in the months that followed with a precision that only grief can produce. Daniel Marsh was employed as a senior project manager at a mid-sized software company, headquartered in Redmond, Washington, a company whose name appeared in the records of the subsequent investigation, but which has been withheld here in accordance with the wishes of the Marsh family. He had worked there for 6 years, managed a team of 11 developers, and was, by every account of his colleagues and supervisors, methodical, reliable, and steady. He took detailed notes in green moleskin notebooks. He kept a whiteboard in his office covered in color-coded timelines. He was the kind of person who sent meeting agendas 24 hours in advance, and who, when a project slipped its deadline, stayed calm and began building a revised schedule before anyone else had finished expressing frustration. He had been hiking solo in the North Cascades and the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest 3 or 4 times a year for a decade. He kept a spreadsheet of his trips, trail name, date, elevation gain, weather conditions, notable features observed, wildlife sightings. The spreadsheet had 47 entries. His Mazama to Goat Peak loop via the Slate Creek drainage was marked in the log as entry number 22, first completed in October 2016, and repeated twice since. The route was 26.4 miles round trip, with roughly 4,800 feet of cumulative elevation gain. Experienced hikers typically covered it in 2 days, camping near the upper meadow below the Goat Peak summit block. Daniel had done it in a day once, in 2018, though he'd told Claire afterward that he'd pushed too hard on the descent and his knees had felt it for a week. This time he was planning 2 days, one night out, back by Sunday afternoon. Light, efficient. He knew the trail. Gary Tesler watched Daniel Marsh pull his pack from the bed of the Tacoma. The pack was a Gregory Baltoro 65, forest green, loaded, but not overloaded. Gary estimated 30 to 35 pounds from the way the man slung it and adjusted the hip belt without drama. He noted a trekking pole pair strapped to the outside, an orange emergency whistle clipped to the left shoulder strap, and what appeared to be a Jeep's unit in the side pocket of the pack. Daniel was wearing Morel hiking boots, the mid-weight kind with a Vibram sole, well broken in, charcoal gray nylon trail pants, a merino wool base layer in dark blue, and a lightweight down jacket that he unzipped and tied around his waist as he walked to the kiosk. The temperature had climbed to 44 degrees. He was already warm from loading the pack. "Morning," Daniel said to Gary, pulling a self-registration envelope from the kiosk dispenser. "Morning," Gary said. "You doing the Slate Creek loop?" "Goat Peak. 2 days. Back out Sunday." Gary nodded. "Overnight lows might dip to the 20s above 5,500 feet. You've got layers? Emergency bivouac bag? Synthetic mid-layer? Full rain shell? I've done this one before." "I know," Gary said and smiled. "I think I've seen you here." Daniel looked at him, and something in the older man's face, the white eyebrows, the fleece vest, the handwritten log spread open on the kiosk shelf, seemed to register as familiar. He smiled back. "A couple of times, yeah." He filled out the self-registration form with a blue ballpoint pen, pressing hard on the carbon copy. His handwriting was neat, blocky, the kind of handwriting that fills forms correctly without overflowing the boxes. He printed his full name, Daniel Marsh, his vehicle plate number, his emergency contact, Claire Marsh, 206-555-0148, his intended destination, his return date. He folded the original, slid it into the permit tube, and tucked the carbon copy into the top flap of his pack. He looked at the trail register board, noted the last signed entry, a couple from Bellingham who'd come down the previous afternoon, and signed his own name below it at 6:28 a.m. with Slate CK Loop/Goat PK written in the notes column. "Have a good one," Gary said. "Thanks," Daniel said. He adjusted his hip belt one more time, clicked his trekking poles open to length, and walked across the parking lot to the trailhead. The pale gravel path disappeared almost immediately into the tree line. Douglas fir and western larch, the larch beginning its September turn, tips of the needles going golden, the first slow fire before the fall. Gary Tesler watched Daniel Marsh's dark green pack disappear between the trees. The last thing visible was the orange whistle catching a slant of early light before the trail curved and the forest closed behind him. The time was 6:31 a.m. By this point in the morning, Claire Marsh was already awake in their home in Redmond, sitting at the kitchen island in her pajamas, with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, watching a cooking show on the small screen mounted under the cabinet. Their daughter, Maisie, who was 4 years old, was still asleep. The kitchen smelled of coffee and the lavender dish soap they kept at the sink, and the morning light was just beginning to touch the backyard maple, which had gone from green to a deep amber at its edges. Claire's phone lay face up on the island beside her. At 6:28 a.m., she received a text message from Daniel. "At the trailhead. Starting now. Love you. Call Sunday at 4. She typed back, "Be safe. Love you." The two messages sat at the end of their thread and waited. Sunday at 4 o'clock came and went without a call. The first 8 miles of the Slate Creek Loop follow a drainage valley along the bottom of a steep-walled canyon, whose walls rise 500 feet on either side, close enough that in the middle of the day you can see sunlight on the upper ridge rocks, but not feel it on your skin. The trail crosses Slate Creek 11 times in those 8 miles, each crossing marked by a cairn and a wooden post with a blue blaze. And after significant rainfall, the crossings require careful balance on wet, moss-covered rocks the size of dinner plates. September 14th had been dry for 12 days running, so the creek was lower than its spring high, running clear over the dark basalt with a sound like sustained applause. The water temperature that day would later be measured, for reasons relevant to the investigation, at 38 degrees Fahrenheit. No one saw Daniel Marsh on the trail that day. The Bellingham couple who had come out the previous afternoon had been the last people on that trail in 48 hours. A trail maintenance crew from the Forest Service had walked the first 3 miles of the corridor the week before. noting no hazards beyond a blowdown across the path at mile 2.4 that they had partially cleared. The portion of trail beyond mile 3 had not been formally inspected since the previous June. Daniel Marsh covered approximately 11 miles on September 14th, based on a reconstruction that would be attempted months later by search and rescue coordinator Owen Briggs, who walked the route himself twice in the course of the investigation. The calculation was based on Daniel's known pace from his own hiking log, the recorded difficulty of the terrain, his departure time, and the likely campsite. His usual first-night camp was in a meadow clearing at mile 11.3 beside a tarn known locally as Copper Lake. Not an official designation, just a name that had migrated from the mouths of regular users into the local trail community's vocabulary. The tarn was the size of half a football field, dark and cold, fed by snowmelt from the ridge above, its surface flat and mirror still in calm weather. At 4:47 p.m., Daniel sent a text message to Claire from the campsite. It read, "Made it to Copper Lake. Spectacular up here. Wish you and Maisie were here. Tomorrow to the summit, and then home. I'm the only person on the whole mountain." The message was transmitted via a Garmin InReach mini satellite communicator that he carried in the lid pocket of his pack. The InReach log would later show that the device had last transmitted a location ping from coordinates 48.71 degrees north, 120.33 degrees west, a point consistent with the Copper Lake Meadow at an elevation of 5,740 feet above sea level. The next scheduled ping, set to transmit every 12 hours, never arrived. The Garmin InReach Mini was never found. Claire Marsh read the message at 4:53 p.m., sent back a string of heart emojis and a photograph of Maisie sitting in the backyard with an ice cream cone, chocolate smeared up to her eyebrows, laughing at something off camera. It was the kind of photograph that makes a parent's heart do something that has no precise anatomical explanation. Daniel Marsh did not reply to it, but the InReach system showed the message as delivered. At 4 p.m. on Sunday, September 15th, Claire Marsh called her husband's cell phone. There was no answer. She texted, "Checking in. Safe?" At 4:30, she called again. At 5. At 5:45, she called the Garmin InReach emergency line, which gave her a recorded message and then connected her to a customer service representative who told her that, based on the last transmitted ping, the device had not sent a heartbeat signal since 4:47 p.m. the previous evening, and that while this could indicate a number of things including a depleted battery, they recommended she contact local search and rescue. At 6:02 p.m. on Sunday, September 15th, Claire Marsh called 911 in Okanagan County. The dispatcher took her information with the efficient calm of someone who had handled such calls before. Hiking party, solo male. Last known location via Jeep satellite ping. Vehicle at Mazama Trailhead, silver Toyota Tacoma. Planned return by 4 p.m. No communication in approximately 23 hours. The dispatcher flagged it non-emergency, a standard protocol for adults, in good health, on a known trail route, with Jeep's equipment, whose return window had been missed by less than 4 hours. A deputy would make a welfare check at the trailhead at first light. Claire Marsh hung up the phone and stood in her kitchen for a long moment. The lavender dish soap was still by the sink. The cooking show had ended hours ago. The backyard maple was dark in the evening. Maisie was asleep in her room. Claire Marsh pressed her hands flat on the island counter and breathed slowly. The way you breathe when you are trying to be a person who does not panic, because you know there is a reasonable explanation. He was probably just slow on the descent. His phone battery was dead. He would pull into the driveway before 10. He did not pull into the driveway. At 7:15 a.m. on Monday, September 16, 2019, Okanagan County Sheriff's Deputy Marcus Velez arrived at the Mazama Trailhead parking lot and confirmed that a silver 2017 Toyota Tacoma Washington license plate was the only vehicle in the lot. Gary Tesler was at the kiosk when Velez arrived, having driven out early after hearing on the scanner the previous evening that a welfare check was pending for the permit he had watched being filled out 48 hours before. He gave Deputy Velez the carbon copy of Daniel's self-registration form, his own handwritten log entry from Saturday morning, and a detailed verbal account of the interaction. The Gregory pack, the orange whistle, the condition of the equipment, the conversation about overnight temperatures, the time of departure, 6:31 a.m., Deputy Velez photographed the trail register with his phone and photographed the Tacoma, which had no visible damage and was locked. He pulled up the last known GPS coordinates on the Garmin InReach account that Claire Marsh had provided and used the Forest Service trail map on his laptop to locate the approximate position, 11 miles in, near the upper meadow. At 8:45 a.m., Velez called Okanagan County Search and Rescue Coordinator Owen Briggs. Owen Briggs was 52 years old, with a face like a topographic map, scored and weathered and precise in its information. He had been leading search and rescue operations in Okanagan and Chelan counties for 19 years, having come to the work after a career as a backcountry guide and wilderness EMT. He kept a laminated copy of the Cooper Color Code Decision Matrix taped to the dash of his truck, not because he needed to consult it anymore, but because new volunteers sometimes rode with him, and it was good to have something concrete to point at when he was trying to explain why they were doing what they were doing in the order they were doing it. He was also, as several of his longtime team members described him in the months after, a person who carried other people's grief with unusual care. Not at a distance, not behind a professional shell, but close, the way you carry something you know is heavy and want to carry well. Briggs arrived at the Mazama trailhead at 10:20 a.m. on Monday. Within 2 hours, he had mobilized an initial search team of 14 volunteers from the Okanogan County SAR unit, 2 K-9 tracking teams, and a request for a Forest Service helicopter based at Methau Valley State Airport in Twisp. The weather on September 16th was cooperative. Clear skies, winds under 10 miles per hour, temperatures in the upper 40s, conditions that Briggs noted in his initial incident report as favorable for rapid sweep of primary search zone. The primary search zone was defined as a 2-mile radius around the last known GPS coordinates at Copper Lake, extended along the most likely route of travel toward Goat Peak Summit. Teams were organized into 4 sweeping groups, 2 teams covering the trail corridor between miles 9 and 14, 1 team sweeping the terrain above the tarn toward the summit block, and 1 team assigned to the descent route Daniel most likely would have taken on Sunday morning. Each team was assigned a radio channel, a mapped grid section, and a 2-way communication check-in schedule every 45 minutes. The helicopter covered the open terrain above the tree line between 11,000 and 7,500 feet. By the end of the first full day, the primary search zone had been swept twice in most areas and 3 times along the most probable travel route. No sign of Daniel Marsh had been found. No discarded gear, no footprints on the soft trail sediment above the creek crossings, no response to horn blasts or shouts, no sighting from the air. The K-9 teams worked a scent trail from a clothing article Claire Marsh had mailed overnight from Redmond, one of Daniel's worn merino base layers, sealed in a Ziploc bag without contaminating contact. Both dogs, a Belgian Malinois named Arlo and a bloodhound named Henrietta, worked the trail from the trailhead forward. Arlo pushed solidly to mile 4.5, then circled and lost the thread. Henrietta followed a parallel track along the creek bottom to mile 6.1 before her handler, a quiet woman named Priya Sood, who wore her dark hair in a single braid tucked under her cap, reported that the dog had gone cold. Not confused, not distracted, but genuinely without scent to follow. This detail would later acquire significance. At the time, it was noted in the incident log as scent trail lost at approximately mile 6.1 and attributed to the creek crossings. Cold running water is an effective scent disruptor, and both dogs had crossed the creek 4 times by that point. But Priya Sood, who had been handling search dogs for 11 years and who trusted Henrietta's nose the way she trusted few other instruments in the world, told Owen Briggs quietly at the end of that first day, she didn't lose him at the creek. She lost him before the creek, at that 4th crossing. She held up 4 fingers. He crossed 4 times, and then he wasn't on the trail anymore. Briggs wrote it in his notebook, not in the official log, but in the small, spiral-bound personal notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. He underlined it. On the morning of Tuesday, September 17th, Claire Marsh drove to Mazama from Redmond, a journey of 3 hours and 20 minutes that she made with Maisie in the back seat in her car seat watching a tablet propped on a pillow, eating goldfish crackers, entirely unaware that she was being driven toward the epicenter of the thing that would restructure her mother's life. Claire's sister, Beth, had offered to take Maisie. Claire had said no, not entirely able to articulate why. Perhaps the belief that having Maisie close kept a certain kind of darkness at bay, the way a small, warm body can sometimes anchor a person to the surface when the current is pulling hard. The family liaison assigned to Claire Marsh by Okanogan County was a woman named Deputy Elena Foss, who was 38 years old and had the unusual quality, observed by several people in the weeks that followed, of being able to sit in silence without filling it. She arrived at the motel where Claire and Maisie were staying at 7:30 on Tuesday morning, with 2 cups of coffee from the diner 2 blocks away and a copy of the daily search briefing. She sat across from Claire at the small table by the motel room window and did not say it was going to be okay. She answered questions directly and honestly, including the questions Claire asked to which there were no answers yet. The search continued for 6 days, expanding its zone with each day that passed without a find. By Thursday, September 19th, the search area had been extended to cover a 12-mile radius around the last known position. Additional resources had been requested and deployed. A second helicopter from the Washington National Guard, equipped with FLIR thermal imaging, which flew 2 nighttime sorties and found nothing that registered as a human heat signature. A volunteer ground team from Chelan County arrived Saturday morning with horses, 7 riders who could cover terrain too steep and dense for foot teams at speed. The mountain rescue team from Seattle, 6 experienced alpinists, cleared the technical terrain on the Goat Peak summit block and the adjacent couloirs. The weather cooperated until Thursday afternoon, when a front moved in from the northwest and dropped overnight temperatures to 24 degrees at the upper elevations, depositing 3 inches of snow above 6,500 feet. The snow complicated everything. Tracks were buried. Scent dispersed further. Hypothermia survival windows, which the incident commander had been calculating against each day since Monday, collapsed. On Friday, September 20th, at the end of the day briefing in the Mazama Fire Station community room, a low-ceilinged space that smelled of old coffee and rubber boots, with a whiteboard covered in grid coordinates and a folded topo map pinned flat across 2 folding tables, Owen Briggs delivered an assessment to the assembled team that he had been composing in his mind for 24 hours with the reluctance of a man pushing against something he did not want to push. He told them that statistical survival probability for an adult in this terrain under current weather conditions, at 72 hours plus without food, water, or shelter beyond what the subject was carrying, was now, in his professional judgment, below 4%. He said this without looking away from any of them. He said, "We are still searching. That 4% is still 4%. Every one of you is doing everything right." His voice was even. The bloodhound handler, Priya Sood, was seated in the back row with Henrietta at her feet, and when Briggs finished, she pressed the heel of one hand against the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened, then let it go. The search continued through the weekend of September 21st and 22nd, with diminishing teams as volunteers were rotated and resources were exhausted. By Sunday, the 22nd, a crew of 18 remained from the original peak deployment of 64. They swept the creek drainage one final time. They found nothing new. The single clue found in those 6 days, the one detail that sat in Owen Briggs's notebook underlined in blue ink, was not debris, not gear, not a body. It was a footprint. At approximately 3:20 p.m. on Wednesday, September 18th, a ground team member named Tom Villot, a 44-year-old volunteer who worked as a high school biology teacher in Oroville during the school year and had been on SAR calls for 7 seasons, found a boot print in a patch of soft silt on the south bank of Slate Creek, 30 feet east of the 4th crossing marker and approximately 12 feet off the established trail line. The print was a single track, partial, the front 2/3 of a right boot, no heel. The lug pattern was consistent with Merrill brand hiking boots in the mid-weight range. The print was pressed deeply into the silt, suggesting significant weight consistent with a loaded pack. The print was oriented at approximately 15 degrees south of the main trail heading, pointing away from the trail and toward the creek bank and the steep brush-covered slope beyond. Tom Villot photographed it, flagged it, and radioed in. Owen Briggs walked to the site himself within 40 minutes. He crouched beside the print for a long time without speaking. The creek made its sustained applause. The larch trees on the slope above were full gold now, the needles catching the afternoon light and throwing it back in a warm, almost domestic color that felt wrong given the circumstances. Briggs took a cast of the print with the foam dental impression compound he kept in his SAR kit. He looked at the slope beyond the creek bank, steep, vegetated with alder and slide alder and devil's club, the kind of terrain that is genuinely unpleasant to traverse and unlikely to be chosen voluntarily. He called Priya Sood and her dog to the site. Henrietta worked from the print outward. She pushed 30 meters into the brush, up the slope, circled twice, and came back. She sat and looked at Priya Sood and then looked away. The handler's signal for nothing retrievable. Priya knelt beside her and said something quiet and private. "She's getting something," Priya told Briggs, "but it's not staying. It's like..." She paused, searching. "It's like it was moved." Briggs wrote this in his personal notebook too, like it was moved. He did not write it in the official log. On Monday, September 23, 2019, at a press conference held in the parking lot of the Okanogan County Sheriff's substation in Twisp, Sheriff Grant Halloran announced the formal suspension of active search operations for Daniel Marsh. He thanked the volunteers. He thanked the families and the community. He said the case remained open and would continue to be investigated. He said there was no indication of criminal activity, that the terrain was challenging, that the weather had significantly complicated recovery efforts, that disappearances of this nature in wilderness areas were not uncommon. He did not use the word death. He did not use the phrase presumed dead. He said, "We have not given up hope." Claire Marsh was not at the press conference. She was in the motel room in Mazama with Maisie, who had fallen asleep with one hand wrapped around her mother's wrist, her small fingers curled in the specific trust of a sleeping child. Claire watched the press conference on her phone with the sound off, the captions a second behind the sheriff's mouth. When the video ended, she set the phone face down on the mattress and stared at the ceiling, which was the off-white of old institutional paint, slightly textured, with a water stain in the far corner shaped very vaguely like a bird in flight. She stayed in Mazama 4 more days before driving home to Redmond. She drove slowly. She did not play music. Maisie slept the whole way. The search file for Daniel Marsh was assigned case number OCOJ 2019-0923-MP-0417 in the record system of the Okanogan County Sheriff's Office, and it was filed in the active missing persons subsection because there was no body and therefore no certification of death. Active missing persons cases in Okanogan County were reviewed quarterly by a detective from the Criminal Investigations Unit. The detective assigned to the Marsh file in the first review, in December 2019, was a man named Ralph Durnan, who was thorough and conscientious, and had 17 other open missing persons files, 3 pending homicide prosecutions, and a significant backlog of property crime cases. He reviewed the Marsh file for 40 minutes, noted that the search had been comprehensive, found no evidence of third-party involvement, and marked the file for maintenance status, available for follow-up investigation if new information developed. No new information developed. The public attention generated by Daniel Marsh's disappearance was, like most such attention, intense and brief. The story ran in the Seattle Times on September 17th and again on September 24th, when the search was suspended. It appeared on local Spokane and Yakima television news for 3 days. It was shared extensively on the Washington hiking community's social media pages, where it generated hundreds of comments, condolences, theories, first-person accounts from people who had been on the Slate Creek Trail, offers of help, and then gradually was displaced by other stories, other disappearances, other accidents, the constant intake of the internet's appetite. A woman named Sandra Gould in Bellevue, who had never met Daniel Marsh, but who had a habit of following missing persons cases with the focused attention of someone who knows, without being able to explain it, that following is a form of bearing witness. Sandra Gould created a Facebook group called Find Daniel Marsh that grew to 4,200 members in 2 weeks, and then plateaued, and then slowly contracted as members lost interest or forgot to check. By the following spring, it had 1,100 active members. By the summer of 2020, it had 680. Claire Marsh never joined the Facebook group. She knew it existed. She had been sent the link by 11 different people. She appreciated the intention behind it in a way that could not be expressed without also expressing the other thing, the thing that lives on the other side of public attention, which is the sensation of having the most private devastation of your life turned into a space where strangers post theories and hold virtual candlelight events and argue in the comments about whether she should have reported him missing sooner. She did not join the group. She read it occasionally. The way you read something you know will hurt you. In the months after the search suspension, Claire Marsh hired a private investigator. His name was Bruce Kellerman, 56 years old, a former King County detective who had retired on medical grounds after a knee injury sustained in a foot pursuit and who had set up a solo investigative practice in Kirkland. He wore bifocals on a cord around his neck that he was constantly picking up and setting down, and he had the habit of writing on yellow legal pads in a compressed hand that was nearly illegible to anyone but himself. He charged Claire $65 per hour, which was well below his standard rate, and he told her privately at their first meeting that he was doing it because he had a daughter Claire's age, and he could not have walked away from this case even if she'd asked him to. Kellerman spent 3 months reviewing the search documentation, interviewing trail users and Forest Service employees who had been in the Slate Creek area in the weeks surrounding the disappearance, and compiling a database of all vehicles that had been photographed or logged at the Mazama trailhead from September 12th through September 16th. Gary Tesler's meticulous log was an extraordinary resource. 8 days of handwritten vehicle records, time of arrival, time of departure, brief notes on anything observable. Gary had photographed everything with his phone camera out of habit, a practice he'd begun after an incident in 2016 where a vehicle had been vandalized at the lot and there were no witnesses. The timestamps on his photographs were precise. 3 vehicles appeared in Gary Tesler's log in the period before Daniel's arrival and again after his disappearance that drew Kellerman's attention during his review. 2 were subsequently traced to registered owners who provided credible accounts of their presence. The third, a gray 2008 Ford F250 pickup, extended cab, Washington plates, appeared in Gary's log on Friday, September 13th at 2:47 p.m., and again in a photograph Gary had taken of the full parking lot at 6:05 a.m. on Saturday the 14th. By the time Gary's 7:45 a.m. photograph was taken, the truck was gone. Bruce Kellerman ran the plate. The vehicle was registered to a man named Peter Rauch, 47 years old, of Twisp, Washington, a town of approximately 900 people, located 11 miles southeast of Mazama on the Methau River. Rauch was listed as the owner of a property maintenance business, Rauch Property and Landscaping, LLC, which had been operating out of Twisp since 2011. He had 1 prior criminal record, a misdemeanor assault charge filed in 2014 that had been reduced to a fine on a plea of disorderly conduct. Kellerman noted the plate, noted the address, and noted that a gray F250 was a common enough vehicle in rural Okanagan County that its presence at a trailhead on a September weekend was not, in itself, meaningful. He put it in a file labeled Vehicles, Low Priority, and there it stayed. Life restructured itself around the absence, the way a river restructures its bed around a new obstruction. Not the same flow, not the same course, but flow nonetheless, because the alternative is not flow. Claire Marsh returned to work in November 2019, 4 weeks after she had gone on bereavement leave. Though bereavement, she would later tell a reporter who interviewed her 3 years after the fact, was a strange word for it, because bereavement implies a body, implies a moment, implies an ending. What she had was an opening without a frame. She worked 4 days a week, managing an accounts receivable team at a healthcare logistics company in Bellevue. She found that numbers were easier than people during this period. Numbers did not ask how she was doing, did not hold her gaze with that particular mixture of sympathy and unease that she had come to recognize as the face people make when they don't know what to say and are trying not to say the wrong thing. She did not formally change Daniel's legal status for 14 months. The state of Washington allowed a petition for a declaration of presumed death after a person had been missing for a minimum of 5 years, without a body being found, absent extraordinary circumstances. Claire was not ready to make that petition. She knew, intellectually, what the survival probability calculation said. She knew what the evidence said. She knew what the absence of his voice, his texts, his presence said. The undeniable accumulated weight of nothing. But knowing and certifying are not the same act, and she was not ready. Maisie turned 5 in March 2020. She had begun to ask in the way that 5-year-olds ask things, with directness that bypasses every social preparation an adult might attempt. where her daddy was. Claire told her he was lost in the mountains and that a lot of people were trying to find him. Maisie accepted this with 4-year-old equanimity that would later shift, incrementally, into a more complex and painful form of understanding as she grew. In the meantime, she drew pictures of mountains, with a small figure walking in them, always in the same green pack. She kept them in a folder that she decorated with stickers. Owen Briggs thought about the Marsh case regularly in the 2 years that followed the search suspension, more regularly than he thought about most cases he had worked, which was itself a signal he'd learned over 2 decades to pay attention to. It was the boot print that stayed with him, specifically pre-issued sentence, like it was moved. A scent trail that ended not at a cliff, not at a creek, not at a technical hazard, but at the 4th Creek crossing, an ordinary, manageable ford in low water conditions, the kind of crossing an experienced hiker in good equipment would complete without difficulty in under 20 seconds. A scent trail that ended there and then produced a single partial boot print on the far bank, oriented off-trail. Not the orientation of a man making a navigation error. Not the orientation of a man pursuing a shortcut. The orientation of a man who had stopped on the trail and then been taken off it. Briggs had filed no report reflecting this conclusion. He had no evidence sufficient to support a criminal referral. He had a boot print and a dog's behavior and a sentence from a handler who he trusted completely. He carried it the way you carry something you can't yet put down and can't yet set right. In June of 2021, 21 months after Daniel Marsh's disappearance, he called Bruce Kellerman. The two men met for coffee at a diner in Twisp, a narrow-fronted place with red checkered tablecloths and a hand-lettered menu board behind the counter, the kind of establishment that smells of bacon grease and has a regular booth for every retired rancher in the county. They talked for 2 hours. Kellerman showed Briggs the vehicle database and pointed to the gray F-250. Briggs looked at the photograph Gary Tesler had taken of the lot at 6:05 a.m. on September 14th. He asked Kellerman where the truck was positioned relative to Daniel Marsh's Tacoma. Kellerman pointed, 2 spaces to the left. Briggs looked at this for a long time. He set down his coffee cup without drinking from it. He asked Kellerman if he'd spoken to Peter Rauch. "Not yet," Kellerman said. "Figured I'd see what you thought first." Briggs nodded slowly. "Don't," he said. "Not yet." And then, almost to himself, "We need to do this right." The morning of Thursday, September 26, 2019, 12 days after Daniel Marsh disappeared, and 3 days after the formal suspension of the active search, a Forest Service wilderness ranger named Cassandra Bright arrived at the Mazama trailhead at 7 a.m. to begin a trail conditions assessment of the Slate Creek corridor, a routine late-season inspection she conducted every fall before the corridor was administratively closed to overnight camping due to the early snowpack. Cassandra Bright was 31 years old, 5 years into her position with the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest, and she had been on medical leave for the first 2 weeks of the search operation, recovering from an appendectomy. She had followed the search on her phone from the hospital and then from her apartment in Winthrop, and she had felt, with the particular frustration of someone kept from a thing they felt they should be part of, both helpless and increasingly restless. She was walking the Slate Creek Trail alone, standard protocol for a routine assessment of a familiar route, with a 30-liter pack, a clipboard, a trail condition form, and a satellite communicator. She reached the 4th crossing marker at 9:40 in the morning. The temperature was 39 degrees. The creek was lower than 2 weeks before, mid-September dry spell continuing, and the rocks at the crossing were fully exposed, gray-brown in the flat morning light, with lichen in pale green and yellow. She noted the blue blaze post, noted the condition of the rock placements, made a tick on her form, and stepped across. On the far bank, she stopped, not because she saw anything immediately, because she smelled something. The smell was faint, carried intermittently on the light downstream breeze, a smell that she would later describe in her written statement to the sheriff's office as organic and heavy, something Swedish, but with something wrong underneath it, like fruit that's gone past ripe. She had been around deer carcasses and a dead black bear on a previous patrol, and she knew that what she was smelling was not identical to those experiences, but it was in the same register. She stood still on the creek bank for approximately 20 seconds, her clipboard at her side, her head tilted slightly, following the smell. She stepped off the trail. The slope above the far bank was vegetated with alder, vine maple, and Devil's Club in a dense tangle that required using both hands to navigate, the clipboard wedged under one arm. She climbed approximately 40 feet above the creek level, moving toward the area where the smell seemed to concentrate. The ground here was soft, a mixture of organic duff and fine silt, deposited by past high water events, and in one section, roughly 8 feet by 4 feet, the ground had been disturbed, not eroded, not dug by an animal, disturbed. A rectangular area of earth that was slightly compacted, slightly depressed relative to the surrounding surface, with vegetation that had been recently pressed down and was only beginning to recover its shape. Cassandra Bright stood at the edge of this area and did not touch anything. She was breathing through her mouth. She took out her satellite communicator and transmitted a location ping and a preset emergency message. Suspicious sight. Require immediate assistance. No immediate danger to myself. And then she took her phone from her pocket and photographed the area from every angle she could manage without stepping onto the disturbed ground. She photographed it for 7 minutes, moving slowly around the perimeter until she heard the sound of her communicator chirping with an acknowledgement signal from dispatch. She sat down on the slope 5 feet back from the disturbed area, facing the creek, and waited. The creek made its sound. The larch trees on the ridge above were fully gold now, the needles thick and warm with color. A gray jay appeared in the alder 10 feet to her left, regarded her with that calculating bird intelligence, and then departed. The smell continued. Okanagan County Deputy Sheriffs Marcus Velez and Dana Holbrook arrived at 11:15 a.m., having hiked the trail from the trailhead with a cadaver dog team. A yellow Labrador named Coda, handled by a man named Steve Aoki, 39, who had been part of the original search operation, and who, when he received the call to return to the area, drove from his home in Omak with an efficiency that suggested he had been waiting for the call. Coda hit the target before Steve Aoki had finished putting her in her working harness. She went straight up the bank, straight to the disturbed earth, and sat. She did not move. She sat with the absolute stillness of a dog doing the one specific thing she has been trained to do, the thing she is certain she is doing correctly. At 11:23 a.m., Deputy Velez radioed the Okanogan County Sheriff's Office and transmitted the following: cadaver dog alert at location, requesting forensic team, county coroner, and immediate notification of next of kin. This is now a crime scene. Owen Briggs was in Winthrop when the call came over his scanner at 11:24 a.m. He was in his truck within 3 minutes. He arrived at the trailhead at 11:51 a.m. and covered the 4-mile trail distance to the 4th crossing in 1 hour and 8 minutes, the fastest he had moved on foot in 3 years, a fact he was not aware of at the time. The forensic investigation team from the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab in Spokane arrived by helicopter at 2:30 p.m. The helicopter set down on a narrow gravel bar 200 meters upstream, the nearest flat surface capable of supporting it. Lead forensic specialist Dr. Ann Kowalczyk, 44, stepped out of the helicopter with the particular focused calmness of someone who has processed hundreds of scenes and has learned that her own calmness is part of the instrument. She had short gray hair cut close on the sides and wore nitrile gloves before she had walked 20 feet from the helicopter. She set up a perimeter with her team, 4 technicians, a photographer, and a forensic anthropologist named Dr. Marcus Webb, who specialized in disturbed site analysis, and she and Marcus Webb walked the perimeter of the disturbed area together for 15 minutes before either of them went in. Burial, Dr. Webb said quietly, not to anyone in particular, but loudly enough that Owen Briggs, standing at the perimeter tape, heard it. Recent, within the last 2 weeks, the ground subsidence is consistent with decomposition gas displacement over 8 to 14 days. He pointed to the slightly depressed center. Subject is likely positioned directly below there. The excavation began at 3:07 p.m. It was conducted by hand, small trowels and natural bristle brushes, with the meticulous slowness that the work required and deserved. Dr. Kowalczyk's team documented every centimeter. The photography was continuous. The smell, which had been present but containable outside the perimeter, intensified as the surface was broken, and the team worked in silence except for the occasional quiet notation of depth, artifact, or orientation. At 4:22 p.m., At a depth of approximately 19 inches below the surface, the excavation encountered what was recorded in the forensic log as upper extremity, left arm, subject clothed. The clothing visible was a dark blue merino wool fabric, the sleeve of a base layer. The sleeve of a base layer consistent with the dark blue merino top that Daniel Marsh had been observed wearing at 6:31 a.m. on Saturday, September the 14th, 2019, by Gary Tesler. Owen Briggs was standing at the perimeter tape when the photographer came over and showed him the image on the camera's screen. He looked at it for a long time. He was wearing his fleece over a long-sleeve shirt, and he put his hands in his pockets and looked at the image and then looked at the trees. He breathed slowly and did not speak. The full excavation required 4 hours and 27 minutes. At 8:49 p.m., with portable work lights brought from the helicopter illuminating the site in a flat, cold white, Dr. Ann Kowalczyk stepped back from the fully exposed remains and said, in a tone that was neither soft nor hard, but simply factual, "We have a complete subject. He's been here since approximately day 1. He was not lost. This was not an accident." She turned to Deputy Holbrook. "Get homicide." The formal identification was completed on Tuesday, October 1st, 2019, through dental records provided by the Marsh family dentist in Redmond. Washington State Patrol Forensic Case Number SP-2019-FOR-4471 identified the remains as those of Daniel Thomas Marsh, 34, of Redmond, Washington. The forensic pathologist's preliminary cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma to the head, with evidence of at least 2 separate impact events. Time of death was estimated at within 12 hours of last confirmed contact, meaning Daniel Marsh had died on or near the evening of Saturday, September 14th, 2019, within hours of sending the text message from Copper Lake. He had not made it to Copper Lake. The in-reach ping had been transmitted from the device, but not from the body. The device had been moved, carried, or transported to the coordinates corresponding to the meadow. Someone had sent it from a location consistent with where an experienced hiker would make his first night camp, so that the search would begin there and not at the creek. The in-reach device was never found. It had been taken. Claire Marsh was notified by Deputy Elena Foss at 9:15 a.m. on Wednesday, October 2nd, 2019. Elena Foss drove to the Redmond house alone and knocked on the door. She was shown into the living room where Claire's sister Beth was also present. Beth had driven over the previous evening when the preliminary identification news had reached the family's attorneys. Claire Marsh was sitting on the couch with both hands in her lap, not folded, just placed there, as if she had set them down somewhere and forgotten to pick them up. When Elena Foss sat across from her and began to speak, Claire Marsh did not look away, did not close her eyes, did not change her posture in any way that was externally visible. She listened to the complete statement. She said, "Did he suffer?" Elena Foss said she couldn't answer that with certainty yet. Claire said, "But quickly?" Elena said, "It appears so." And Claire Marsh nodded once, very slowly, the kind of nod that is not agreement, but simply the act of receiving something that cannot be refused. Then she turned her head toward the hallway where Maisie could be heard in her room talking to her stuffed animals with the focused seriousness of a child engaged in an important narrative. And her face did something that Elena Foss would not describe in any report or in any subsequent interview, but that she carried, intact, for years. The determination that Daniel Marsh's death was a homicide, formally issued by the Washington State Patrol Forensic Laboratory in its report dated October 14th, 2019, transferred primary jurisdiction of the investigation from Okanogan County Search and Rescue to the Okanogan County Sheriff's Criminal Investigation Division, which in turn requested investigative support from the Washington State Patrol Major Crimes Unit. The lead investigator assigned from the Major Crimes Unit was Detective Sergeant Vivienne Ladd, 46, an 18-year veteran of the WSP who had previously worked complex homicide cases in Yakima and Pierce counties. She had a particular competence with staged crime scene analysis, cases in which a perpetrator had taken deliberate action to alter, conceal, or misdirect the evidentiary record. Her supervisor would later say, in an administrative review, that if you needed someone to reverse engineer a deliberate construction of false narrative, Vivienne Ladd was among the best he had seen. She read the Marsh file over 2 days, made notes in a green spiral notebook, and then drove to Twisp, on the morning of October 19, 2019. Her first stop was not the crime scene. It was Gary Tesler's house. Gary Tesler lived in a well-maintained single-story home on Twisp River Road with a kitchen garden in the side yard and a covered porch where he kept 2 chairs and a small table. He was watering his kale when Detective Ladd pulled up. He brought out a pitcher of water and 2 glasses and sat with her for 90 minutes. She asked about every vehicle in his log from September 12th through September 16th. She asked what he remembered seeing that had not made it into the log. She asked him about the gray F250. Gary Tesler rubbed his white eyebrows with one hand. He said, "That one? Yeah, I saw that truck before. Before September 13th? It was there earlier that season. I want to say July, maybe August, a couple of times." He looked out at the road. "It's not a trailhead truck. You know what I mean? Some trucks you see and they look like they're there to use the trail. That one? I don't know. Too clean. The cab looked too clean. You don't drive a work truck on these roads and keep the cab that clean." Detective Ladd wrote this down. She asked if he had any photographs of the truck from earlier in the season. He said he'd check. He found 2, one from July 19th, one from August 8th. Both showed the gray F250 in the lot, cab facing out. In one photograph, the truck was clearly visible as having no trail permit on the dash. In both photographs, the truck appeared to be unoccupied. No figure visible in or near it. A truck at a trailhead. No permit. No visible trail use. 2 previous visits. Detective Ladd drove from Gary Tesler's house to the Okanogan County Assessor's website on her phone and pulled up the property record for Peter Eldon Rauch, Twisp, Washington. Rauch owned 2 parcels. The primary residential property on a county road 4 miles east of Twisp, and a second smaller parcel described as improved commercial property, secondary structure, located 3 miles farther east on the same road, adjacent to a section of National Forest land. She pulled the business records for Rauch Property and Landscaping LLC. The business had filed consistent tax returns, listed 2 employees including Rauch himself, and held valid contractor licenses in Okanogan County. It maintained a website, basic, functional, last updated in 2018, that listed services including lawn maintenance, irrigation installation, land clearing, and outbuilding construction. There were photographs of the work, well-made wooden fences, concrete pads, a small equipment barn with neat board and batten siding. The photographs were well composed. The properties in them looked cared for and ordinary. Detective Ladd ran Peter Rauch's criminal history again, the 2014 misdemeanor assault. She obtained the underlying case file. The incident had involved a hunting dispute. Rauch had confronted a man who had been camping in an area Rauch had, without legal basis, claimed as his own hunting territory. The confrontation had become physical. The other man, a retiree from Chelan named Bernard Holloway, had sustained a broken orbital bone. The charge had been reduced to disorderly conduct after Rauch's attorney argued that the altercation was mutual. Bernard Holloway had declined to continue pursuing civil action. The arresting officer's narrative in the original incident report included a note that Ladd read twice. Subject displayed controlled demeanor throughout arrest and booking, showing no distress or remorse, expressed only concern about time lost from his work schedule. On October 23, 2019, Detective Ladd obtained a search warrant for both parcels owned by Peter Rauch, the residential property on County Road 47 and the secondary commercial property 3 miles east. The warrant was based on the vehicle record, the circumstantial connection to the crime scene location, and the forensic analysis of the disturbed burial site, which had determined through soil composition analysis that the burial had been prepared. That is, the hole had been dug before the victim was placed in it, indicating premeditation rather than a spontaneous act of concealment. The application was reviewed and signed by Okanogan County Superior Court Judge Patricia Holt at 11:30 a.m. on Thursday, October the 24th. The search operation was conducted on the morning of Friday, October the 25th, 2019. It was overseen by Detective Ladd with a team of 60 agents, 4 Okanogan County deputies, and a forensic evidence team from Spokane. 2 additional deputies were stationed at the county road intersection to manage access. A second warrant was obtained for the detention of Peter Rauch for questioning, a civil detention, not an arrest warrant, as probable cause for arrest had not yet been established. Peter Rauch was not at home when the search team arrived at County Road 47 at 8:12 a.m. His gray F250 was parked in the gravel driveway beside a late-model flatbed trailer, loaded with chain-link fencing rolls. The house was a single-story ranch, beige vinyl siding, dark green metal roof, with a covered carport and an attached shop that faced the road. The lawn was mowed in precise parallel strips. The flower beds flanking the front porch contained no flowers. It was late October, but the beds themselves were edged cleanly, the soil raked. A child's bicycle was leaning against the porch railing. The bicycle was small, pink and white, with training wheels. There were no children associated with Rauch in any record. When this detail was noted in the subsequent report, no explanation for the bicycle was ever identified. The shop door was unlocked. Inside, a riding mower, a gas-powered tiller, irrigation pipe in organized bundles, cans of paint and solvents arranged by size on metal shelving, a pegboard wall with hand tools hung on labeled hooks. Everything in a place, everything labeled. The floor was poured concrete, swept clean. The room smelled of motor oil and dry wood. There was nothing that appeared out of the ordinary to a superficial inspection, and a superficial inspection was not what Detective Ladd was conducting. She was looking at the walls. Specifically, she was looking at the south wall of the shop, which measured 18 feet from corner to corner, and which had, from the door, the appearance of a solid wall of vertical board and batten paneling, painted the same gray as the shop exterior. The pegboard tool wall was on the north side. The south wall held the shelving units, but the shelving units did not reach the east corner. There was a 6-inch gap between the last shelf unit and the east corner wall. The wall behind the gap was the same paneling, but the floor in front of the east corner, a 6-inch strip of concrete between the shelf unit and the east corner wall, was lighter in color than the surrounding floor, lighter in a way that suggested it had been less exposed to foot traffic, which was consistent with a section of floor that was occasionally covered and occasionally uncovered. Detective Ladd asked WSP agent Marcus Piper to move the last shelving unit. The unit slid on casters. It had been fitted with heavy-duty plastic casters on its base, an installation that had been made after the concrete was poured, based on the visible marks. The unit rolled 3 feet east. Behind it, the paneling had a vertical seam that ran from floor to ceiling, with a small indentation at the midpoint of the seam at hand height, a finger pull. Not a standard door frame. A panel fitted flush to the wall with concealed hinges, designed to be invisible. When the shelf unit was in front of it, Agent Piper pulled the panel open. The smell that came from the opening was not the smell of a storage space. It was organic and contained, the kind of smell that accumulates over time in a space with limited ventilation, a space in which human beings have existed. It was not overwhelming. It was, in some ways, worse than overwhelming. It was the smell of a long duration, a smell that had been established and maintained and sealed. It was the smell of wool blankets and perspiration and canned food and something medicinal, like cheap antiseptic. Detective Ladd put on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves and stepped through the panel. The room beyond was rectangular, roughly 12 feet by 9 feet based on the subsequent architectural survey. The ceiling was approximately 7 feet high, constructed of poured concrete with a wooden form finish on its surface, smooth and gray-brown. The walls were concrete block, painted white, the paint yellowed and slightly peeling near the ceiling seam where moisture had wicked down. The floor was bare concrete with a single rubber anti-fatigue mat, the kind used in commercial kitchens. Centered in the room, roughly 3 feet by 5 feet. In the southeast corner, there was a folding metal cot with a blue sleeping bag on it, old model REI, the kind that had been in production in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The sleeping bag was compressed and creased in the specific way of something that has been slept in repeatedly over many nights. It was folded back rather than closed, as if whoever had last used it had simply gotten up. There was a metal folding table against the north wall, 2 feet wide, 4 feet long. On the table, a Coleman camp lantern, propane-fueled, with 3 fresh propane canisters beside it, a plastic water container of the military canteen type, empty, a metal spoon, a food-grade plastic bucket with a sealing lid of the type used for bulk food storage. The bucket was empty, but residue on its interior walls was consistent, based on later laboratory analysis, with commercially canned beef stew. 3 stacks of magazines, car magazines, a hunting catalog, 2 copies of an outdoor sporting publication from 2017, aligned precisely with the table edge, a small orange hand towel, folded into a neat square, a pair of handcuffs open, resting on the concrete beside the table leg. On the east wall, at a height of approximately 4.5 feet, there was a single metal staple set into the concrete block, a U-bolt of the type used for rigging or heavy anchoring, embedded with what appeared to be epoxy anchoring compound. The epoxy was old and had been applied with care. Attached to the U-bolt by a short length of aircraft cable was a padlock, closed. The aircraft cable had 2 abrasion points, areas where the steel stranding had been worked repeatedly over time, against the lock or the bolt, in the particular pattern that suggests sustained pressure by a human hand. Detective Ladd stood in the center of the room for a long time. She did not speak. She looked at everything once without touching anything. Then she looked at everything again, more slowly, and in her green notebook she wrote, "This was used before him. This was used for a long time." Then she stepped back through the panel, called the forensic team, and began the documentation process that would last 48 hours. Peter Rauch was located at 10:47 a.m. at a supply yard in Twisp, where he had been loading sections of split rail fencing into the bed of a borrowed truck. He was detained without incident by 2 deputies. The detention was later described by the arresting deputies as unremarkable. Rauch had not run, had not raised his voice, had not asked any of the questions that a person being detained for questioning in relation to a disappearance might be expected to ask. He had looked at the deputies with a steady, flat expression, set down the rail he was carrying with the deliberate care of someone who does not want to damage property, and said, "I'll need someone to let my dog out. He's at the house." Peter Eldon Rauch was 47 years old. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall, 195 pounds, with a wide face and pale blue eyes set relatively close together, and the kind of tan that comes from years of outdoor labor. Not an even tan, but a working tan, dark on the hands and forearms and the back of the neck, lighter where clothing covered skin. He wore a gray canvas work jacket and a baseball cap with the name of a local feed and supply company. His hands were large and capable looking, with a cut on the right index finger that was healing, about a week old. He looked, in every particular, like the owner of a small landscaping business in rural Washington, a man you would not look twice at, in a hardware store or a diner or a trailhead parking lot. He was transported to the Okanogan County Sheriff's substation in Twisp and placed in an interview room. Detective Ladd and WSP Special Agent Danny Chu conducted the interview, which lasted 6 hours and 43 minutes across 2 sessions. In the first session, which lasted approximately 3 hours, Rauch answered every question with the measured cooperation of someone who had thought carefully about the experience of being questioned. He knew Daniel Marsh. They had met at the trailhead, he said, a few times over the past couple of years. He liked to watch hikers come and go. He'd been using the Mazama lot as a staging area when he had jobs in that area of the county. He had been at the lot on September 13th and the morning of the 14th for work reasons. He had a job at a property in Mazama that weekend, he said. He could provide the address. Ladd gave him nothing in her expression. Chu wrote, "The interview room smelled of industrial cleaner and old coffee, and the fluorescent light in the ceiling made a faint, high-pitched hum that was just below the level of conscious notice." Rauch sat with his hands folded on the table and answered questions for 3 hours in the same flat, measured tone with which he had set down the fence rail before the deputies. He did not sweat. He did not blink too often, or not often enough. He was, in the entirety of this first session, the most difficult kind of interview subject, a man performing normalcy with such facility that the performance was invisible. Then, Detective Ladd set a photograph on the table. The photograph showed the interior of the hidden room, specifically the east wall with the U-bolt and the aircraft cable. She slid it across the table without speaking. She watched his face. Peter Rauch looked at the photograph. He looked at it for 4 seconds. Then he looked up at Detective Ladd, and then he looked at the wall beside her, and then he looked back at the photograph. He unfolded his hands and put them flat on the table, fingers spread, and he looked at the space between his hands. He breathed. He breathed again. And then, very quietly, he said, "I want a lawyer." He did not speak again for 11 days. The forensic analysis of the hidden room produced 847 individual items of evidence, cataloged over 3 days. Among them, recovered from the seam where the concrete floor met the east wall, adhering to dried organic material that had accumulated in the gap. 2 hairs, both consistent with Daniel Marsh's DNA profile, confirmed by the WSP Forensic Laboratory on November 3, 2019. The handcuffs bore Daniel Marsh's skin cells on the interior face of the locking mechanism. The aircraft cable, when examined under magnification, contained fiber transfer consistent with the merino wool base layer Daniel had been wearing on the day of his disappearance. What the evidence established, reconstructed by forensic analysts, and presented in subsequent legal proceedings was this. Daniel Marsh had been taken from the Slate Creek Trail at the 4th crossing on the morning of Saturday, September the 14th, 2019. He had been transported in Rauch's vehicle, tire impressions in the soft soil near the logging road that paralleled the trail corridor 1 mile west, accessed through a Forest Service gate that Rauch, as a registered contractor with Forest Service access credentials, had a key to, were matched to the F250's tire specifications. He had been held in the concealed room. For how long exactly could not be established with medical certainty from the physical evidence alone. He had died there, from injuries consistent with blunt force trauma to the head, inflicted by an implement consistent with a 24-inch steel pry bar recovered from the shop floor, bearing trace DNA evidence. He had then been transported back to the trail corridor and buried at the site where Cassandra Bright found him, a location selected, forensic reconstruction suggested, to make discovery unlikely while maintaining proximity to the narrative of a hiking accident. The Garmin InReach device had been used to generate the false location ping at 4:47 p.m. Rauch had driven or hiked to the coordinates corresponding to Copper Lake after securing Daniel at the concealed room, triggered the device's communication function, and returned. The text message made it to Copper Lake. Spectacular up here. Had been composed by Rauch and sent from Daniel's InReach. Rauch had access to the InReach because he had taken Daniel's entire pack. The pack, later found in a burn barrel behind the secondary commercial property, had been burned but not completely. Fragments of the Gregory Baltoro's structural frame, the waist belt buckle, and the orange emergency whistle remained in the ash. The whistle was identified by Gary Tesler from photographs. He recognized it immediately, and he turned away from the photograph for a moment when Detective Ladd showed it to him, pressing one hand flat against his chest before turning back and nodding once. The prior history of the hidden room, the question implicit in Detective Ladd's notebook notation, this was used before him, became the most disturbing dimension of the subsequent investigation. The forensic analysis of the room's surfaces produced biological material from at least 3 separate individuals, in addition to Daniel Marsh, based on DNA typing. The identities of 2 of these individuals were never established. The third, identified through comparison with a National Missing Persons database sample held by the FBI's National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, was a 29-year-old man named Tyler Vance Harmon, who had been reported missing while on a solo backpacking trip in the Methow Valley area of Washington in August 2017. His case had been classified as a presumed wilderness accident after a 3-day search found nothing. His remains were never found. His parents, in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, had continued to maintain a missing persons page. The identification was made on November 29, 2019, and the notification of Tyler Harmon's parents was made by a Major Crimes Unit liaison officer on December 2nd, a Monday, at 9:30 in the morning. What happened in Tyler Harmon's parents' living room in that moment belongs to them alone. The State of Washington versus Peter Eldon Rauch was filed in Okanogan County Superior Court on December 18, 2019, on 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, with a sentencing enhancement for the deliberate concealment of a body and for conduct indicating a continuing criminal enterprise related to the second unidentified DNA profile and the Tyler Harmon DNA match. The charges were subsequently amended in March 2020 to add a count of abduction in the first degree and 2 counts of kidnapping with intent to harm, based on additional forensic evidence developed from the hidden room and from Rauch's electronic records. A tablet computer recovered from his residence contained photographs taken inside the hidden room, photographs that were never described in public reporting at the explicit request of both the Marsh and Harmon families. Peter Rauch was held without bail. He entered a plea of not guilty on all counts at his arraignment on January 9, 2020. He was represented by a public defender, a woman named Rebecca Sola, who was competent and thorough, and who made every argument available to her. Challenges to the search warrant's probable cause foundation, challenges to the DNA sample chain of custody, a motion to suppress the InReach device records, all of which were heard and denied by Judge Patricia Holt. The trial was originally scheduled for September 2020, was continued twice due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and finally convened on February 8, 2021, in the Okanogan County Courthouse in Okanogan, Washington, a civic building of tan brick and dark trim that squatted at the intersection of 2nd Street and Larch, a block from the Okanogan River. The trial lasted 16 days. The prosecution was led by Okanogan County Deputy Prosecutor Sandra Esterhazy, 51, a methodical, deliberate attorney who had prosecuted 31 homicide cases in her career and who never raised her voice and never needed to. She presented evidence in chronological sequence, building from Gary Tesler's trailhead log through the forensic reconstruction of the burial site, through the DNA analysis, through the hidden room documentation, through the digital evidence from the InReach manipulation, each piece fitting against the next, with the unhurried precision of a structure being assembled correctly the first time. Gary Tesler testified on the 3rd day of trial. He wore a dark suit jacket over his olive fleece vest, a compromise between formality and the identity of the garment that had, by then, acquired the status of a talisman. He described the morning of September 14th in detail that was, by every account of those present, exact. The time, the temperature, the Gregory pack, the orange whistle, the handwriting on the permit form, the last sight of the dark green pack disappearing between the larch trees. When he was asked by Prosecutor Esterhazy to identify a photograph of Peter Rauch, Gary Tesler looked at the photograph for several seconds, then looked at Peter Rauch, where he sat at the defense table, and said without inflection, "That's him. The man who was in the lot the day before, and the morning Daniel Marsh came in." Peter Rauch, at the defense table, did not change expression. Owen Briggs testified on day 6. He described the scent trail loss at the 4th crossing, the partial boot print, Priya-Sood's assessment. He was precise and careful, presenting the evidence as evidence, not as conclusion, in the manner of a professional who understands the difference. On cross-examination, Rebecca Sola pressed him on the gap between the boot print finding and the decision not to formally note it as potentially criminal. Briggs said, "I didn't have enough to charge anyone. I had a dog's behavior and a single print. I made a judgment that going in wrong, before we had what we needed, would be worse than going in right." He paused. "I still believe that." Sola had no further questions. Dr. Ann Kowalczyk testified on days 8 and 9, presenting the forensic reconstruction in a manner that was methodical and unemotional, and that precisely because of its methodical unemotionality was devastating. When she described the evidence of premeditation, the pre-dug burial site, the InReach manipulation, the concealed room, she used language from her forensic report, clinical and exact. The jury listened with the stillness of people absorbing something they cannot make smaller by listening harder. The most extraordinary testimony came on day 11 from a forensic psychologist named Dr. Imani Foster, who had been retained by the prosecution to provide context for the behavioral evidence, specifically the pattern of conduct revealed by the room's preparation, the multiple prior uses suggested by the DNA evidence, and the extraordinary calmness Rauch had displayed throughout his detention and the early phase of his questioning. Dr. Foster had published extensively on predatory behavior patterns in isolated environment crimes, and she gave testimony that the jury clearly attended to with high focus, leaning forward in their chairs with the particular posture of people being given a key to something. Dr. Foster said, "The deliberate organization of this environment over multiple years represents a level of preparation that is incompatible with impulsive conduct. The individual responsible for creating and maintaining this space did so with patience, with attention to operational security, and with a complete absence of moral conflict that is visible in every structural choice, from the concealed access to the pre-positioned supplies to the evidence management behavior that followed each incident." She paused. This was not a place built in anger or desperation. It was built calmly, over time, by someone who had planned it and who felt entitled to do what he did within it. Peter Rauch listened to this testimony with his hands folded on the table. He did not look at Dr. Foster. He looked at a point approximately 18 inches above the witness box, with an expression that was neither distressed, nor contemptuous, nor defiant. It was simply nothing, an absence of the kind of response that the room seemed to be waiting for. On February 24th, 2021, after 6 hours and 12 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned verdicts of guilty on all counts. When the presiding officer read the verdicts aloud, the courtroom remained quiet in the way that courtrooms sometimes go quiet, not relieved, not celebratory, but absorbed, as though the reality of the verdict were something that had to be held carefully while it was processed. Claire Marsh was in the second row behind the prosecution table, with her sister Beth on her left and a victim advocate from the prosecutor's office on her right. She did not react visibly when the verdict was read. She folded her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead. Peter Rauch received 2 consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 72 months on the kidnapping and concealment counts at sentencing on April 9, 2021. Judge Holt read her statement of sentence in a voice that was even and deliberate, and that carried through the entire courtroom without being raised. She said, at the conclusion, "The court is aware that no sentence available under Washington law is proportionate to the conduct described in this record. The court imposes the maximum available under the law. That it is insufficient is a fact the court is required to state." Peter Rauch was transported from the Okanogan County Jail to the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla on April 14, 2021. He made no statement at sentencing. He made no statement to the press. He has made no public statement at any point since his arrest. His property maintenance business, Rauch Property and Landscaping LLC, was formally dissolved in January 2020. The 2 properties on County Road 47 were seized by Okanogan County under forfeiture proceedings in September 2020. The residential property was sold at auction. The secondary commercial property, the one with the shop, the concealed room, remained unsold for nearly a year. It was eventually purchased by a land conservation organization, and the structure was demolished. The concrete below the shop floor was jackhammered out. The property was allowed to return to scrubland. By the summer of 2022, native grasses had begun to colonize the disturbed earth, and the former building pad was identifiable only by a slight irregularity in the ground surface. The identities of the 2 individuals, whose biological material was found in the hidden room and never matched to known missing persons, remain unknown. Their cases, if they are cases, if they are persons, if somewhere there are families who are still experiencing the particular suspended grief of not knowing, are maintained in open status in the NamUs database. Every year, the database is searched against new entries. So far, no match has been made. The investigation into Tyler Harmon's disappearance in 2017 was reviewed by the Chelan County Sheriff's Office in light of the evidence. The 3-day search that had been conducted at the time was re-examined. The reviewing investigator, Detective K. Burnside, 43, determined that the search, while consistent with the protocols of the time, had not covered the logging road access point that the forensic reconstruction of the Marsh case identified as Rauch's extraction route. The road existed in 2017. The gate existed in 2017. Rauch had held Forest Service contractor credentials since 2009. Burnside's review report concluded, the available evidence suggests that the investigative outcomes in the Harmon matter would have been materially different had the access road been included in the initial search perimeter. This conclusion is made not to assign blame, but to inform future protocol. The Washington State Department of Natural Resources updated its contractor access credential protocols in 2022, implementing a GPS tracking requirement for all credentialed access to Forest Service gate systems during active missing persons investigations. Owen Briggs retired from the Okanogan County SAR coordinator position in March 2022 after 21 years. His retirement party was held in the same Mazama Fire Station community room where he had delivered the 4% survival probability assessment to his team on September 20, 2019. 47 people attended. Gary Tesler was there, in his olive fleece vest. Priya Sood was there with Henrietta, who was 11 years old and moved carefully, but found the smell of the room interesting. Briggs gave a short speech in which he thanked people by name, and in which he did not mention Daniel Marsh or the Marsh case directly, though most of the people in the room thought about it anyway. After the party, he drove home, and in his driveway he sat in his truck for a while before going inside. His wife came to the window and tapped on the glass, and he looked at her and then got out. Claire Marsh returned to the Mazama trailhead once, on September 14, 2022, the third anniversary of Daniel's disappearance, a Saturday as the original day had been. The air at the parking lot carrying the same smell of pine resin and cooling granite, the same pewter gray light in the early morning before the sun cleared the ridge. She came alone. Maisie was with Beth. She walked to the trailhead and stood at the point where the trail entered the trees, and the larch light came through the canopy in the early morning the way it had been coming through when Gary Tesler last saw the dark green pack. The needles were going gold. They were always going gold in September. That was the thing about this country. It did not change its seasonal schedule on anyone's behalf. The larch turned gold in September, whether the year was catastrophic or ordinary. She stood there for approximately 10 minutes without moving. She was not crying. She was just standing, with her hands at her sides, looking at the place where the path went between the trees and curved and disappeared. A gray jay came and went in the larches. The creek could not be heard from here, but she knew it was there. She knew exactly where it was. She turned and walked back to her car. She had a 4-hour drive. Maisie would want dinner by 6. There was a new folder in the kitchen drawer at home with 12 more mountains and green pack drawings in it, accumulated over 3 years, and on the latest one, drawn 2 weeks ago in crayon, imprecise and vivid, Maisie had printed at the bottom in her 7-year-old hand, in letters slightly too large for the space, but placed with fierce intention, "Datey went this way." Claire had not been able to look at it for more than a few seconds at a time. She looked at it for a few seconds every day. She got in the car. She adjusted the mirror. She put it in reverse. The morning was cold and clear, and the mountains above Mazama were the same mountains they had always been. Enormous, indifferent, completely unable to account for what had happened on their lower slopes 3 years before, or for what had been waiting in an ordinary-looking shop on County Road 47, or for the distance between a text message with a heart emoji and the truth that had been buried 12 feet from a trail that a man had walked 11 times and known by name and loved, the way people love the places that have given them the experience of being, for a few hours, entirely themselves. The case file, State of Washington versus Peter Rauch, case number OCSU 2019-1218-CR, remains on appeal before the Washington Court of Appeals, Division 3. The appeal challenges 2 evidentiary rulings issued during trial. The underlying convictions have been upheld in 2 prior appellate reviews. The 2 unidentified DNA profiles from the hidden room remain in the NamUs database as open entries. Anyone with information is encouraged to contact the Washington State Patrol Major Crimes Unit. Maisie Marsh turned 8 years old in March 2023. She is doing well in school. She has recently become interested in birds.
What are your thoughts on how this investigation unfolded, or the chilling history of that hidden room? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to support the channel and make sure you don't miss our next deep dive, please hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and give this video a like. Thank you so much for watching, and stay safe out there.